Hi. A couple of you asked about a question that you might have in an interview about what things you'd consider important as you set up your first class of your NQT year or something similar. Of course, in the latter part of your placement, when you would have been gradually moving to taking over responsibility of about 80% of the teaching time, this would have come to the fore of your mind as the more practical consideration of taking responsibility for your own class would have started to kick in. But the lockdowns, of course, has made that difficult. So I thought I'd make this presentation to start to help you to consider some things that will be important for you to think about as you start to take up your first appointment. Not just to answer that question at the interview, but to really start to think about what's important as you take up your first teaching job. Here's a bit of a checklist. Let's unpick some of the practical actions for each of these ideas. We've talked a lot about the importance of reducing extraneous cognitive load on the working memory in order to free it up for analysing and connecting with what's already in the long-term memory, and the importance of being able to retrieve ideas and concepts from the long-term memory to the working memory. In planning lessons, this means working on really learning one key idea rather than lots in one lesson, and using techniques such as worked examples and partially worked examples to help children to focus on the most important aspect to learn. So reducing cognitive load is one key thing to think about in your first term. In presenting ideas to the class, it means making sure that materials that you're presenting to them don't split their attention and that they don't contain text and images which divert the attention of the working memory away from what you want them to learn. And questions are presented without lots of extra words or images. It means that the classroom should be laid out with as few distractions as possible. Displays might focus on working walls rather than simply children's work, and you might consider whether there's glare, whether the room's too hot, too cold or too dark. You might consider each child and how the environment looks to them as a learner. Is there too much colour and too little contrast for children with visual impairment? Is the child who finds it hard to concentrate asked to sit too near sources of distraction, such as a window by the playground? We will have to think of new ways to lay out furniture, etc. in response to the COVID period, but thinking about how to lay your classroom out with as few distractions as possible is a really important step to take in the first few days. It means thinking about giving only the instructions that children can use quickly rather than lots at a time, so that the learner's working memory is not overloaded. It's really important as well to spend some time at the beginning of the year to establish classroom routines so that they become routine. So children don't have to think about what to do when, for instance, getting ready for break, where to put the pens at the end of the lesson, where to store the books, how to lay out the desks for different tasks, because those things are automatic. They're not going to spend working memory thinking about them. And we know that it's important for the information stored in the long-term memory, not just to stay there, but to be retrieved and mixed with new information in the working memory. So planning to build in low and no stakes tests to the learning is effective. Instead of rereading or re-studying information, you might have low stakes practice tests, for instance, asking all of the children to show their answer on the whiteboard, so a show me, and then feedback to everybody. No grading or marking, leave that for the assessment part of the lesson, but to recall or recap some of that information from the previous session, just a quick show me on the whiteboards is good. Tick it out the door. Ask a question and they all write their answer on a slip of paper and pass it to you as they go out the door. Feedback after break to everybody. No grading or marking. Leave that for the assessment part. A bell test. As they enter, give them a slip of paper to write down an answer about something they learned yesterday. So you've got those at the beginning of the lesson and you can see where they are in relation to yesterday's work. Spaced practice has also been found to be an effective way of aiding retrieval. The strength of things that are even deeply learned and encoded can fade. returning to ideas briefly to shake off the dust, or integrating concepts that are already learned into new learning, for instance triangles into the 3 times table, using addition when learning about graphs, can aid retention. We've talked about the importance of modelling to the children the processes of metacognition, modelling the process of planning what you'll do, stopping to check that you're on the right track, and then evaluating whether the way that you chose to approach the problem was effective. Using strategies such as live mock, sharing the thinking out loud. What do I know about these types of questions? How do I usually feel when I meet them? What strategies do I know? Modelling monitoring. How's this going? Am I being successful? Do I need to change tack? And of evaluation. Was it successful? Will I use that strategy again? And building opportunities into lesson plans for children to develop these skills for themselves. We also know from research that feedback that explains what was good or bad, why it might have been good or bad, and what might come next is one of the most effective strategies in teaching and learning, rather than just marking correct or incorrect or giving praise without explanation. Right at the beginning of the year, we looked at Coe et al.'s meta-analysis of what makes great teaching. And if you remember, the 2 most important things are content pedagogy knowledge and quality of instruction. Understanding what you're going to teach, and we've seen this year that sometimes what we think is common sense is not quite common sense. Why is the sky blue? Why is a square a rectangle? As well as understanding the pedagogy, why it's important that we show shapes in non-prototypical orientations, for instance, why equal difference is a good strategy for subtraction. What are the usual misconceptions, such as where to place commas and why we use an exclamation mark. As NQTs, it's important to continue to learn about the content and pedagogy of everything you want to teach, and not just to teach it in the way that you were taught or the way that you were shown by somebody else to teach it. It's also important to refer to good practice in instruction, such as Rosenstein's principles, not as a checklist, but to refer back to ideas such as regular review of concepts, teaching new ideas in small steps, scaffolding new ideas, asking lots of questions, etc. And it's important to understand that the key to improving behaviour is having good relationships. It's important early on to make sure that you really get to know what makes every child in the class tick. What are their likes and dislikes? What helps them to engage and what stops them? Spending time on class building activities which get the children to know each other and to know you are really important early on in a new year, every year and not just for the NQT year. It's also important to get to know parents and carers. Go out and talk to them early so that they can see that you care about their children. It makes it much easier if you have to deliver bad news later on or to get them on side. You set the tone, remember. If you're positive, they're more likely to be positive. Your generation of new teachers is the first to have been drilled in the idea of evidence-informed education, so you'll be bringing a more developed idea about what's important in your first year than simply things like make sure you say hello to all of the kids every day or make sure that you change their books every week. You're much more informed about evidence than any other generation of teacher has been before. So those are some of the important things to think about in terms of teaching in your first term. So you can do a pick and mix and think about what you might like to highlight in any particular interview, but there are things to think about beyond an interview. There are lots of sources of more personal advice, but I do find some of it quite fatuous. For instance, this is a list from the TES. Taking vitamins and doing meditation might be helpful for some people, but you're adults, so you can make adult decisions about how you'll look after yourself. But for what it's worth, here's a couple of bits of advice from me. Workload's much better than it ever has been. Things might be a bit different for a while or even for quite a while because of coronavirus, but you'll need to establish a pattern of working that's comfortable for you. You'll meet many teachers who will tell you that you're not doing it properly unless you're up all night or working all weekend. And that's the kind of attitude that leads to teacher shortages and, more importantly, teacher unhappiness. There's literally no need for that. Spend more time thinking than simply doing. Reflect like you do now. What was good? What wasn't good? What would work better next time? You know what the important things are. Do those, and don't waste time doing things like laminating things you're only going to use once. Remember, if you do what you've always done, you'll get what you've always got. Mentoring of NQTs is getting better. If in doubt, ask them. If your mentor's not working for you, talk to someone on the staff that you do get on with and trust, but do ask someone if you need to find out. The last little bit I'd like to say in terms of advice is stay away from the drains and go and sit by the radiators.